Good morning. The bell has rung. We're going to sing a song here in a moment, but there are a couple of announcements people have been asking about, so we'll get the word out about these things. These will be repeated when everyone is in here during our 10 o'clock hour, but just so that you know, Dan Ratliff's funeral. Dan Ratliff passed away on the weekend. So on Tuesday morning at 9:30, there will be a visitation here, 9:30 to 10:30, and then the funeral service will be at 10:30 in this building. So that's for Brother Dan Ratliff, Tuesday morning, 9:30 visitation, 10:30 funeral service. To accommodate that, the ladies' Bible class that generally meets on Tuesday mornings at 10 is canceled for this week. Also, it is a 49ers Tuesday generally, so we're going to postpone the 49ers. We can do 49ers the next week. So we're making those two changes in schedule. Also, just be aware that tonight at 6 o'clock, the Central Church of Christ, downtown Little Rock, is having their annual singing in which they invite churches all around to come and participate. So if you would like to be at Central tonight to experience and enjoy that and worship with people from around Central Arkansas, that's in their building tonight at 6. We will have our 5 o'clock service as usual, but I will be going over there when we wrap up our 5 o'clock service here. And if somebody wants to go and ride with me, if several people do, I'm not sure, the youth are going to go. So depending on how many vans they use, we might have a van available. So be aware of that tonight, and we'll have those good things going on. So we are in a study about unlocking kindness, keys to kindness. There are various attributes, characteristics that feed well into kindness. One of those is composure. You know, we don't really think about composure being a Bible word, but we're going to make a case for that this morning. Composure is going to be our attribute and word of study that helps us to unlock kindness, to practice kindness, be kind to others. But we like to start with a song, so Brother Paul Moore is kindly going to come help lead us in a song as we get our minds and hearts right for our morning class and worship. All right, Brother Paul. Today's key to happiness, the attribute that will help us to unlock kindness, is composure. I mentioned before we sang the song, we don't think of composure very much as a Bible word. I want to point you to this, the book of Romans chapter 8 and verse 25, which is speaking of our hope. So we're walking through life. We are journeying on our faith walk through the span of our lifetime, knowing that Jesus is coming. The redemption of all things is before us, and we are patiently awaiting those things, living faithfully, keeping the faith as we move towards that day. It's our day of hope. And so Romans chapter 8 and verse 25 says this, "But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience." That's the English Standard Version and a rather common translation for that word at the very end, patience. But the Amplified Bible, I don't know if any of you use the Amplified Bible very much. The Amplified Bible is a helpful thing. The Amplified Bible will take the verses as we know them. The Amplified Bible was originally done with King James language. And then after words that can have some nuance of meaning or sometimes are not in our usual vocabulary, the Amplified Bible will put some alternate words. And so composure is a word. So think about that. As we are walking through life, keeping the faith, there is suffering and chaos and difficulty around. There's a lot of activity that's happening, earthly distractions, but the hope of Jesus is set before us, and so we're faithfully walking through that, doing so with patience, but think about doing all of that with composure. So composure is a word that speaks to calmness of mind, to words that de-escalate anxiety and division rather than to escalate those things, a calmness of action. The opposite then of composure would be to walk through life with anger and anxiety and impatience and to be reactive to the things that are around. But Christians, because we have that hope that is set before us, because of the assurance, the confidence, the security in which we live life, we're able to keep our composure when others are not. I know this is not a Bible thing, but the good definition of composure that I thought about is the line from Rudyard Kipling in the poem he wrote called "If," and you'll be familiar with the first line. "If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs, that's a good thing." So remembering that line, and that line, it speaks to me of composure. That's keeping our head, even when all around us people are losing their minds. If we can keep our head, and therefore streamline in a good way, composure in our words and our actions and our treatment of others and the peace of mind that we have ourselves, then that's a good thing. So I looked up that Rudyard Kipling poem, and although I was familiar with that line, "If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs," I was reminded, because I'm sure that I looked at this in high school or sometime along the way, but it is a 4-stanza poem, and I think all of it does speak to composure. And as I read it, I recognized there are a lot of scriptural themes in it. So here's what we're going to do to start class this morning. I'm going to read the poem "If" by Rudyard Kipling, and then we're going to turn to the book of Ephesians chapter 4 and start reading at verse 25. And I think we will hear an echo going back and forth between Kipling's "If" poem and the sort of composed life that we're called to live on in Ephesians chapter 4. Now, poems are tricky, so I have to read it well, and you have to listen well to get the most out of it, but I thought it worth sharing. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too, if you can wait and not be tired by waiting or being lied about, don't deal in lies, or being hated, don't give way to hating, and yet don't look too good or talk too wise. If you can dream and not make dreams your master, if you can think and not make thoughts your aim, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same, if you can bear to hear the truth you've spoken twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools, or watch the things you gave your life to broken and stoop and build them up with worn out tools, if you can make one heap of all your winnings and risk it on one turn of the pitch and toss and lose and start again at your beginnings and never breathe a word about your loss, if you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve your turn long after they are gone, and so hold on when there is nothing in you except the will which says to them, hold on. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings, nor lose the common touch, if neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you, but none too much, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and what is more, you'll be a man, my son. Then I'm going to read Ephesians 4. If you can remember some of those concepts, calls in Kipling's poem, then listen to some of these things. And this is just taking a little section out of Ephesians 4, which is telling us how we should then live as a Christian. I think you'll hear a lot of those things in different words, and yet these attributes repeated. Therefore, having put away falsehood, let each one of you speak the truth with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and give no opportunity to the devil. Let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor doing honest work with his own hands, so that he may have something to share with anyone in need. Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, by whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you with all malice. Be kind to one another. I want to remind you our class theme is kindness. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another as God in Christ forgave you. So here are some of the, we're talking about attributes and characteristics that unlock kindness. Composure is just one among several, and there are attributes that help us to live a composed life. So all of that goes together. If we need a illustration that is rather common, getting this material from a book by Greg Atkinson called Unlocking Kindness, and composure is one of his chapters. Here's the way that he begins his chapter. He talks about former Indiana basketball coach Bobby Knight, and he puts forward as an illustration Bobby Knight as a man who frequently lost composure. He tells a story about a certain time when the referees made a call that Coach Knight didn't care for, and he spent the rest of the game haranguing that referee and stomping around and swearing at everyone until such point after them he was fined $10,000 for his behavior that night, and that still didn't change anything. So he lacked composure. Now I do want to say, telling that story, I always found Bobby Knight very entertaining. So when he was throwing chairs, that was sometimes a bit too far, but I always did find it entertaining, and he was a smart guy, and he knew how to win some basketball. But the other illustration that Greg Atkinson gave was Coach John Wooden, goes back a little further than Bobby Knight, but Coach Wooden was the UCLA coach when UCLA had the greatest sort of winning streak and series of championships that have been known in college basketball. And in this particular story, the UCLA Trojans had won 88 straight games, 88 in a row. But they lost to the University of Houston in the 89th game. And the game did seem to turn on a referee's call against UCLA that did seem a little bit questionable. But he didn't react the way that Bobby Knight reacted, in the ways that Bobby Knight would have done that. So after the game, in a press conference, a reporter asked him how he felt about maybe how this one call that was questionable had cost the team their winning streak and caused it to end at 88. And what he said was, here was his first line. He said, "Well, I'm sure there were several calls that went our way. So I just want to congratulate the University of Houston and their coach and their team, and so he handled it in that way, and kept his composure throughout. So he was good about those things. So if we can take those illustrations and in our own life recognize we're walking through life each day, and some things are not going to go our way, and sometimes we're going to be slighted. Sometimes things are say and do questionable things, and we would like to throw a flag, and beyond throwing the flag, we might also want to stomp around and yell and throw a chair. But that's why we have this lesson on composure. And note that composure is a Christian characteristic that while we may not find that word in the Bible, we find the concept embedded in several words. For instance, let's look at Colossians chapter 4. Colossians chapter 4. Colossians 4, the book of Colossians is very much like the book of Ephesians. Colossians and Ephesians written at the same time and delivered by the same letter carrier to these two churches that were close together, Ephesus and Colossae. And so has much the same message laid out in the same way. But here's just a couple of verses. We read a lot in Ephesians 4. Here's a little bit in Colossians 4. Listen to verses 5 and 6. Walk in wisdom. That word's going to come up again a little later in our lesson. Walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. And answering a person is a challenge, especially if a person is coming at us and they are aggressive and accusatory and complaining. Then for us to be able to answer with conversation that is seasoned with salt, that's appropriate, that de-escalates instead of escalates the situation, then then that's a good thing. In relation to that, look at James chapter 3. Maybe the first place where lack of composure shows up is in the tongue. So having read Colossians chapter 4 and verse 6 about the having conversation that is gracious and seasoned with salt, then I thought, well, I'm going to turn over to James 3, because I know James 3 says some things about that. I've already had a long reading this morning from Ephesians 4, so we're not going to read all of James 3, but we could, and it would be a great lesson. And it's all about the tongue, and what it really does contrast, the contrast in James 3 is the person of composure who is able to keep their tongue, and then a person who lacks composure, and they are all over the place in anger with angry words and words that tear down. So chapter 3 of James is the passage that compares the tongue to a small fire that can start a blaze if it is not controlled. In verse 8, it compares it to a wild animal that cannot be tamed. It is a restless evil full of deadly poison. It is a member of our body that oftentimes goes two different ways, sometimes cursing and sometimes blessing. And James says both those things ought not to be coming from the same tongue. So if we are a person of blessing and of gracious speech, then we want to practice that and do that. Let that outnumber the days when we are doing the cursings. And then there's this. I mentioned a minute ago that wisdom was going to come up again. Listen to James chapter 3. We are going to read 13 through 18. And who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. And all that just kind of shouts composure to me, that description. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. But the wisdom from above is, first, pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere, and a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. And it does occur that when we read those words in James, that those are all composure words and descriptions of being composed. When Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount said that when slapped on one cheek, if we can turn the other cheek instead of reacting and doing so with violence and hatred, if we can turn the other cheek, that's composure. We're keeping our head. That other person's lost their head, but we're keeping our head. If someone will go the second mile, Jesus said, if someone compels you to go a mile, forces you to go a mile, go with him too. That speaks to a person whose life is composed. As a matter of fact, the most, I'm sure I've shared this before, but the most memorable sermon that I ever heard on that particular passage, if somebody compels you to go a mile, go with them too. The most memorable sermon I heard about that, for one thing, was memorable because I heard it on two successive Sundays. It was two different preachers, and they both gave the same lesson on the same text, and it wasn't the kind of lesson where one person handled it one way and the other person handled it the other. They obviously had both read the same book, and they had the same source and were using the same illustrations. But also, it was a wonderful lesson. I was happy to hear it again. It was a wonderful lesson that really described, I never had put that much thought into that go the second mile. And this is I'm going to give the shortened version, but but really it was an illustration of a composed person versus a person who's not composed. And they described the Jewish man who might have, towards the end of the day, been trying to use the cool of the evening to do some hoeing in his garden, and was looking forward to just finishing that, going into his house, having the meal that would be waiting for him there, and then having a nice relaxing evening, when all of a sudden he sees coming down the road a Roman soldier carrying a heavy pack, and he says to himself, "Oh no, not now." And the soldier comes and says with some gruff soldier authority, "Here, man, carry my pack." Well, the law in Rome was if a soldier commanded you to take his pack, you had to carry it. And I'm sure they didn't call it miles back then, but anyway, you had to carry it a mile. The word is, and I know I heard this in the summer series that we just had on the Sermon on the Mount, and it's generally mentioned in this passage. That happened with enough frequency. With the movement of Roman soldiers in Jewish territory, that happened with enough frequency that most, I won't say most, many Jewish men had stepped off the mile from their house and put a stake in the ground so that when they were called upon to go a mile, they could go a mile exactly and say, this is as far as you can make me go. And so this particular man saw the soldier coming. The soldier said, "Carry my pack." So he said the man threw down his hoe and grabbed up the pack and started off walking ahead of the soldier as fast as he could walk. The soldier had to two-step to keep up with him. The man didn't say a word all the way there in that next mile. He let his displeasure be known by stomping his way and walking fast. And finally, when he gets back, when he gets to the stake that he has in the ground, he throws the pack down beside it, and without a word of any to the soldier, then goes back home. By now it's getting dark, and the hoeing didn't quite get done. Supper's late. He comes in the house. The cat meows, so he kicks the cat because he's still angry. And the supper is there, but it's cold, and he takes a bite and throws his fork back on the table and tells his wife to take it away. And then he yells at the kids before they go to bed. And that is not having composure. In the garden, towards the end of the day, the soldier comes and says, "Here, man, take my pack," and says so in a rather gruff way. But this man leans his hoe up against his shed and says, yes, sir. I bet you traveled a long way today and you're tired." So he takes up the pack and he walks with the soldier, and along the way he talks with the soldier about where he's been and where the soldier has been and where he's going, and about the soldier's family back home, and shows some interest in the man. And as they get on down the road, the soldier kind of gets the feeling they've gone a little bit more than a mile, and he's enjoyed the conversation, but he finally brings that up and says, "Well, I'm sure you've completed your journey with me now. I'll take the pack and go the rest of the way." And the man says, "Oh, I'll just get you over the hill over here, and once we get over the hill and on the other side, then I'll make my way back home." And so continues the nice conversation, and gets the soldier over the hill and wishes him a good day. And when he goes back home, he pets the cat and thanks his wife for holding supper for him, and tells his kids a bedtime story and puts them to bed. And this is the life of one who is composed, who has composure. And so that's what we're talking about today, is being composed in that way. And there are then a lot of composure words. Maybe composure doesn't, that translation of words doesn't appear much in our scriptures, but again, the concept is there. Here's one place that it is. Look at Galatians chapter 5. the familiar fruit of the Spirit passage. But Galatians chapter 5. See the whole list as composure, someone who's composed in life, but also there's some particular words. The last one's going to be self-control. Composure is about having control of your spirit, of your mind, of your behavior, of your tongue, being able to act in ways that are good and pure and kind, by the way, because with composure we're trying to unlock kindness. Kindness is going to show up in this list as well. And composure then is a way of having and demonstrating calmness in a situation instead of escalating things to chaos. So think about all of that when we read this list of the fruit of the Spirit. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. So all of these things that we have discussed to this point, the self-control, peace and patience, turning a cheek, going a second mile, having conversation that is seasoned with salt. All of those things are descriptive of the composed life. Here's an illustration from the life of Jesus. So look at Luke chapter 22. Remember Rudyard Kipling's line, if you can keep your head while everyone about you is losing theirs? In Luke chapter 22, beginning at verse 47, this is a Garden of Gethsemane scene described by Luke. Jesus had been praying. And in Luke 22:47, while he was still speaking, that is to his apostles, those with whom he had prayed, there came a crowd. We might say a mob, but there came a crowd. They're unruly. And the man called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He drew near to Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus said to him, Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? And when those who were around him saw what would follow, they said, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. So it seems to me this episode has quickly lost composure. We have swords and words and blood, ears being cut off, confrontation. And that's everybody. It's Judas, it's the apostles, it's the mob who came out. Verse 51, but Jesus said, no more of this. And he touched his ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests and officers of the temple and elders who had come out against him, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? So Jesus was being non-resistant. Then at this point, he wasn't going to shed any blood. He wasn't going to swing any swords. As a matter of fact, he brought composure from his own behavior and his own words. He brought composure to that scene of chaos. The opposite of composure are words like anger, anxiety, impatience, being reactive. We have phrases like having a short fuse and flying off the handle. Well, Jesus showed us how not to do that in this episode of his arrest. He taught us how to do that in the Sermon on the Mount with the turn the other cheek and the go the second mile verses that he has given to us. And then here's a word that very well I think could the word composure, if it were in these passages, might speak to us better than the words that are here. So turn to the book of 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 5. 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 5. So we're not going to read all of them. There are several more than what we are going to read. But there is a description of behavior and of containing your emotions, taming your words, being sure that your actions are active in a good way instead of reactive in a bad way. And that is the phrase in the English Standard Version. It's sober-minded. I think in our King James versions and some other versions, it's just the word sober. But I think it does help a little in the ESV to have sober-minded, because it's speaking of our mind, our spirit, our calmness that we bring to any given moment. And there are several passages where this word sober comes up. And so I don't know about you. Here's one reason I think the word sober doesn't connect with me a lot. Sober, I always think about sober as the opposite of drunk. So somebody's drunk, somebody's sober. And that is a good little picture to have, and does speak to some composure. Somebody who's in their right mind and in control of their senses and their behavior and their words, as opposed to someone who's lost all of that because of the chemicals they've ingested. And yet, that picture, sober is opposite of drunkenness, is somewhat helpful. This is my fault, I'm sure, and not the fault of the words, but when I see the word sober, a word that always comes to my mind, unspoken, is somber. So be sober, be somber. So be serious, and kind of, I don't tell jokes, that kind of thing. And so that's not real helpful. But sober-minded, I think, is helpful. But what if the word composure was stuck in there? Because I really think that's what it's being talked about. If composure is having control of your senses, your behavior, your words, your actions, then I think that's what God's word is trying to tell us with the word sober. So it gets used in several places. 2 Timothy chapter 4 and in verse 5, the word is used as Paul tells Timothy about the sort of spirit that Timothy should have. And Timothy is this evangelist in this city where there are some challenges and some difficulties. The church is not getting along great in several areas, and it's Timothy's there, but while he's trying to do a good job in his ministry, he's facing some foes and some people who are trying to stir things up in other ways. And so Paul tells him that he should, and as a matter of fact, if you read the verses before it, verse 3 talks about people who are trying to suit their own passions, and those who don't listen, but instead wander away from the truth. And so he tells Timothy in verse 5, as for you, that may be what these other people are doing, lost in their passions and suiting themselves and turning away from listening. But as for you, always be sober-minded. How about we put composed in there? You always be composed. When somebody else is not, you show them the spirit of composure. So be composed, endure suffering, do the work of an evangelist, and so fulfill your ministry. Here's another. Let's look at Titus chapter 2 and verse 2. 2 Timothy, Titus. In Titus chapter 2, the immediate context is older women teaching the younger women some things about their life. And so in verse 5, teach them to be self-controlled, that is, to keep composure in the household, pure, working at home, kind, submissive to their own husbands, so that the word of God may not be reviled. So have a composure within the home that makes for a peaceful home, rather than rather than one of chaos. And then one more, 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 7. We have to go past the book of Hebrews. 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 7. How about this opening line in that verse? The end of all things is at hand. Okay, so, no, doesn't that sound like something that maybe could lather us up into a dither? The end of all things is at hand. What are we going to do? Therefore, be self-controlled. Keep your composure. Be sober-minded. Keep your composure for the sake of your prayers. So when we have this context about us where circumstances are challenging and others are losing their heads and there's a general excitement in a bad sort of way, then if we practice self-control, sober-mindedness, both of those words speak to composure. I want to mention that Greg Atkinson mentioned in this chapter that because of his anxieties is the word that he used, and certain characteristics in his spirit, he has trouble with this, and so he mentioned he says I take medication to even me out, and so I recognize that has to happen. And he also had come from a dysfunctional family. So he said, I came from this dysfunctional family. I have these anxieties and these chemical imbalances. So I'll take some medication to help even that out. But he wants to pursue composure in every way that he can, including as with the Spirit of Christ. He does note that composure sets a tone in the home. And because of his own dysfunctional family, he says, if you didn't learn that from your father, then learn it from your heavenly Father, to be self-controlled and sober-minded. Composure is a choice, but it also has to be a practiced, learned ability. You choose to be composed, but you do have to practice it and learn it. And when we do, composure produces peace and calm, which is an atmosphere for kindness.